Can I start, Shafaq?
Go
Yes,
ahead,
Mr.
Mr. Farhan. We
Khan.
can see you, we can hear you.
Hi, good evening, respected doctors. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar series from Novo Nordisk Sri Lanka. We have today president of two key associations in Sri Lanka in one forum. It's indeed a great privilege for us. Thank you, Dr. Matthews, and thank you, Dr. Garu Singhe, for accepting our invitation and being today here. I am Param Sher Singh. I am the country manager for Sri Lanka and Maldives. Currently, I am based in India because of the current pandemic. I am not able to come to Sri Lanka, but very soon I'll be coming to Sri Lanka and meeting you all in person. Thank you so much. I am not at all going to come between you and the attendees or the doctors for the scientific session. I just wanted to give you some glance about what is this company Novo Nordisk, what we do, where are we, and what is the future pipeline for us. Just to give you a glance, Novo Nordisk is a leading global healthcare company founded in 1923. Our headquarters are in Denmark. So our purpose is to drive change to defeat diabetes and also other serious chronic diseases such as obesity, rare blood disorders, and also endocrine disorders. We apart from diabetes, we are also venturing into obesity. We are also in growth disorders and hemophilia. If you have, if I have to say at a nutshell, what is this company? We currently employ around 45,000 people globally. We are present in 169 countries. Our affiliates are in 80 countries. Every second patient in the world takes Novo Nordisk insulin. This is the strength of this company. We have our R&Ds in China, Denmark, India, UK, and US, but we have strategic production sites in Denmark, Brazil, China, France, and US. Next slide. So, Dr. Novo Nordisk R&D strategy is highly innovation focused. As I've already alluded, our therapy areas are diabetes, hemophilia, which is the rare blood disease, and then you have obesity. We are also venturing into newer areas like chronic kidney disease. We are also entering into chronic CVD. We are in NASH and also in Alzheimer disease. So our strategic focus is always innovation, doctor. We have been doing it for the last 100 years, and expansion and also externalization. We are a very high technology savvy companies. If you know, Novo Nordisk is there for the last 100 years. There are a lot of innovation we brought in the field of diabetes, like we have the injection devices. Now we are also working on stem cell, and the current innovation which we have done first time in the world is the oral GLP-1, which I'll definitely let you know. Next. So we have been developing life-changing product, doctor. If you have to ask me, one product per year over the past decades, and this has been done through constant innovation. Apart from human insulin, which were there before 90s, so we brought the analog insulin in 1999, which was Novorapid Aspart. Then we in 2002 we brought biphasic insulin aspart, which is Novomix 30, and then in 2004 we brought insulin detemir, which is Levemir. 2009 we brought liraglutide, the first GLP-1 injection, which is Victoza for brand. All these molecules are available for doctors in Sri Lanka. Apart from this, we do have insulin degludec, which is ultra long acting basal insulin, which is Tresiba as the brand name. Then in 2014, doctor, we brought the first combination of two different insulin, that is degludec and insulin aspart in one pen, which is called the Ryzodec. Very soon we will be launching Ryzodec in Sri Lanka. And then in 2015, there was again remarkable innovation in the field of diabetes, insulin and GLP-1 in one pen, which is called Jultufy. In 2016, we brought the liraglutide 3 mg, and then in 2017, we brought the faster acting insulin aspart, which is Fias. Now in 2021, we are also bringing oral semaglutide, first GLP-1 oral semaglutide to be administered orally. Apart from diabetes, doctor, as I have already told you, we do have our hemophilia product, which is rare blood disorders, and then growth hormone. We have factor 7, we have factor 8. Now we are working on factor 9, and also we are working on factor 13. Next slide. So, doctor, all these innovations has been backed with lot of landmark programs. We have lot of landmark trial. We have the Begin trial, then we have the Leader trial, which was the largest CVOT trial for Victoza. Then we have the Devote trial, which was for Tresiba. Then we have the Boost trial, which was for Isodec. We have the Pioneer trial, which is for our oral semaglutide. There are a lot of study. We have the Step trial. We have the Frontier, Essence, this Essence, Soul. All these trials now, as I have said, we are already venturing into newer areas like NASH, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease. Next slide, please. So, doctor, as you all know, we have been celebrating 100 years of insulin innovation. There is a remarkable innovation over the past 100 years, and there is more to come, doctor. So, a century of innovation in diabetes care, what we say. This innovation started way back in 1921. The life-saving innovation was done, and in 1922 this became a reality because the first dose was administered. After that, doctor, in 1960 there was a new era in diabetic understanding where we came to know what is type 1, what is type 2. And then in 1985 there was another innovation which makes life simpler for a diabetes patient. It is an easier and safer way to manage diabetes. We launched the insulin devices, doctor, so the patient can be very easy take insulin on their own. Then in 2012, doctor, again there is a next level innovation happened in the field of diabetes. We brought the new generation insulins. If you see the current conventional insulin, the patient have to wait for half an hour, right, before food. Now the patient can take insulin with meal, after meal, because of this analogs. And then another 2021, what next? It is driving change to defeat diabetes. We are bringing the first oral GLP-1 in a pill. So all this has been done through constant innovation for the last 100 years. Next. So, doctor, Novo Nordisk vision is very simple: improving lives of people with diabetes. We are guided by the Novo Nordisk way. The Novo Nordisk way tells us where we are, where we want to go, and the value that characterizes our company. Just one thing I would like to allude here is, doctor, every innovation in Novo Nordisk has been done keeping in mind the patient at the center. So if you see, we are guided by 10 essential, and the number one essential is we create value by having a patient-centered business approach. So, doctor, it's a great honor for me to speak in front of this mammoth audience. Today we have doctors listening to us from Sri Lanka and also from other parts of Asia. Thank you so much for a patient hearing. I now give the dais to Dr. Asiri, who is the medical manager of Novo Nordisk, to take it forward. Thank you so much. Over to Dr. Asiri.
Good evening, everyone. So it's my pleasure to welcome all you to this interesting webinar on how to protect your diabetes patients during COVID pandemic in collaboration with Sri Lanka College of Endocrinologists and Sri Lanka College of General Practitioners. And we have a very interesting lecture lined up for today by a very prominent speaker who's an expert in diabetes, and by the Sri Lanka College of President Sri Lanka College of General Practitioners. Without much ado, I would like to welcome and introduce our chairperson for today, Dr. DKD Matthew, MBBS, FCGP, Senior General Practitioner, President, College of General Practitioners of Sri Lanka. So I would like to invite you, sir, to take on the proceedings for today. Dr. Matthew, we can't hear you.
Doctor, you are muted.
It's muted, sir, from your side. Now it's no, not yet.
Sir, you are muted.
Now okay.
Good evening to everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Asiri. Today's webinar is about a very apt topic, how to protect your diabetic patient during COVID pandemic, organized by Sri Lanka College of Endocrinologists and College of General Practitioners of Sri Lanka, hosted by Novo Nordisk. On 31st December 2019, the World Health Organization was informed of a cluster of cases of pneumonia of unknown cause occurring in Wuhan, China. On 12 January 2020, it was announced that a novel coronavirus had been identified. From these cases, the virus is referred to as SARS-CoV-2 and associated disease as COVID-19. As of today, globally, 187 million diagnosed cases with 4 million fatalities. Of those who develop symptoms, 40% have mild symptoms without hypoxia or pneumonia. 40% have moderate symptoms and non-severe pneumonia. 50% have significant disease, including severe pneumonia. 5% experience critical disease with life-threatening complications. The risk of severe disease and death is higher in people who are older, male, from deprived areas and certain ethnicities, obese and pre-existing medical conditions such as diabetes and heart disease. When a diabetic gets a viral infection, it can be harder to treat due to fluctuations in their blood sugar levels and their immune system being compromised. This leads to a longer recovery times. Also, virus thrive in an environment of elevated blood sugar. The most important way people living with diabetes can lower their risk of becoming seriously ill with COVID-19 is to avoid catching SARS-CoV-2 virus in the first place. Aspects regarding the way to protect your diabetic patient during the COVID-19 pandemic would be discussed by Dr. Chaminda Garusinga, consultant endocrinologist, Colombo South Teaching Hospital. He is a product of Faculty of Medicine, University of Peradeniya, where he topped the merit list with a first-class pass in the final examination. Underwent mandatory foreign training at St. Bartholomew's Hospital and St. George's Hospital, London. Presently, he is the president of the Sri Lanka College of Endocrinologists. Over to you, Dr. Chaminda Garusinga.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. Thank you. First of all, let me thank Novo Nordisk for organizing this meeting. Yeah, there are a lot of participants I can see, mostly general practitioners. And I must also thank the College of General Practitioners of Sri Lanka for initiating this endeavor and informing its membership about this this important topic. And actually, College of General Practitioners of Sri Lanka has been really active in this regard. I saw their newsletters and their journal that they have dedicated a big portion of content on COVID in a very elaborative manner. So my task today is to give you an outline how the diabetes patients are getting affected by COVID-19 infections and why they are more susceptible and what we can do to prevent these complications and occurring in our diabetic patients. Can I see the slides, please? Slides, please.
No, Doctor, I've given the control. You want to change, or I can change it for you.
All right. Yeah. How do I change?
Yes, you have control of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The first one. We missed the first one actually. Can you go back? Can you go back?
Sir, you can do it yourself.
Or let Shafaq do it. The doctor is having issue. Let Shafaq do it.
Okay.
Shafaq, go to next slide. First one.
First one.
Yeah,
Right.
go ahead.
Now, the importance of diabetes in the course of this illness has been identified widely. Now, these are what the professional bodies concerned with diabetes care had to say about COVID and type 2 diabetes or diabetes. So, American College of Clinical Endocrinologists say that diabetes and high glucose levels are associated with increased complications, respiratory failure, and mortality in hospitalized patients with diabetes. ADA, there's a lot of literature you can find in ADA websites about diabetes and COVID and vaccine and so on. It says that your risk of getting COVID-19 is likely to be lower if your diabetes is well controlled. Actually, it's a very good positive note rather than frightening our patients. They say that if your diabetes is well controlled, then the risk of contracting a severe disease is much less. And IDF also have their position statements about diabetes, and the RSSD in India also talks about the COVID and diabetes. So this all indicates that this is a very important condition for the diabetic patients because they are at a higher risk of death and complications due to COVID. Next slide, please. Now, this is the normal, complications of diabetes that we all know. We categorize it into microvascular complications, macrovascular complications, and some of the complications that are independent of vasculature or whatever, like social factors and so on. But if our patients listen to all the advice given by the doctors, and if they adhere to the healthy lifestyle and continue with their medications or insulin or whatever, then everyone's HbA1c should be 6%. But it doesn't happen in reality. There are multiple factors that affects the control of diabetes. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, this is a lifestyle disease. So whatever the changes in lifestyle is going to affect the overall control of diabetes. And it involves many factors actually. It's not only the lifestyle, but there are other factors, accessibility, reduce accessibility to routine care because these patients need to be seen regularly by doctors because their blood sugar fluctuates and they develop new complications and they develop some unrelated complications. So these patients should be under doctors, care all the time. But this era, because of the pandemic, due to the lockdown and restrictions of movement, social distancing, and so all that, our patients have lost the contact with their doctors. So they have just been, isolated, right, in the community because they have no access. And then there is a big element of unhealthy eating. When they're at home, they tend to make various, sweet stuff and stuff rich in carbohydrates, starch, and then their diet has become very unhealthy. And one of the other important things is lack of exercise. So patients who used to walk and who used to be active in their daily routine are like housebound, so they can't move about. So that increases the blood sugar, obviously. And not only that, these patients are susceptible for other illnesses, like some patients develop cellulitis of the leg, some pneumonia or myocardial infarction. So they have various other intercurrent illnesses that are more common in diabetic patients. So when that occurs, the access to the healthcare system is limited, and that is going to adversely affect the outcome. And on top of that, there is economic burden because the insulins and oral hypoglycemics that involves a cost, even though it is free in most of the places, but countries, the majority of more than 50% of patients depend on their own funds to get their insulin and the medication. So economically also our patients are affected these days. Next slide, please. Yeah. And again, the COVID-19 has been linked to worsening diabetes control and diabetes ketoacidosis in pre-existing type 1 and type 2 diabetic patients. So if you read the literature, there are plenty of articles, plenty of reviews saying the same thing due to various reasons, some of which I have listed down here. Deviation from the healthy dietary patterns which we discussed, restriction of exercise, medicine supply, that has been a problem not only in here, even in the developed countries that has been a problem, and the effect of SARS-CoV-2 virus on the pancreas, because there can be new onset diabetics that come in with very high blood sugar and COVID just because of the COVID infection. So that has been observed, and there are new literature evidence appearing every day. And there's a thing called stress hyperglycemia. Now there are people who develop high blood sugar when they are exposed to stress, and that can improve over time. But this has been linked to the poor outcome of any illness. Now, there are studies done on ICU patients admitted with myocardial infarction. Actually, the ones who have developed new hyperglycemia, like those who are not diagnosed diabetics who develop new hyperglycemia, they did worse when compared to non-diabetic patients. So that's a big problem. And use of steroids. Now the steroids somehow has come into the picture. Now steroids are widely used, especially in hospitalized patients with COVID, and their blood sugar goes up, and that effects can last months. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, and there are thoughts that whether the diabetic patients are more susceptible to contract COVID-19 infection. Now, all this time we thought whether you have diabetes or not, it is the same mechanism of transmission. Like we are not more susceptible to contract the illness. But there were this hypothesis that most of these patients are on ACE2 inhibitors and ARBs, angiotensin converting inhibitor medications. And those medications are known to increase the ACE2 receptor expression in your lungs and so on. And for some reason, this virus, it hijacks the receptor to get entry into the cell. So the same receptor is being used by the virus to gain entry into the host cell. So the reason for high number of these receptors present in the surfaces could be that they are exposed to the ACE inhibitors and ARBs. And there were thoughts initially whether you should stop ARBs and ACE inhibitors at first because they increase the risk, but now it has not been shown to be very important in the pathophysiology of the viral invasion. Next slide, please. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, is it about chronic diabetes related complications that we should be worried about? Next slide, please. Yeah, now these are the multiple factors that affect these patients with COVID-19 infection. Now most of the patients are obese, and obesity has been linked to worse outcome. And in diabetic patients, there is what is called ongoing chronic inflammation. So when you check the inflammatory markers, they find that there is a slightly high inflammatory markers levels in diabetic patients. Now in COVID, we do procalcitonin, CRP, serum ferritin, and so on. So they are the LDH, they are the markers of inflammation or markers of worse prognosis in COVID. But in diabetic patients, they have found that these markers, the procalcitonin and so on, are higher when they get COVID infection. And there's a coagulopathy. Now our diabetic patients are having a sort of a pro-coagulate coagulable state. So their coagulation pathway is already slightly more activated. So they are developing thrombi easily. So the COVID, it causes thrombosis. Now the postmortem studies done in Italy and so on, they have found that patients who have died of COVID has thrombosis in the microvasculature of the lungs, as well as in the legs, DVT, and various types of strokes, various types of thrombi. And there is hyperglycemia that can cause ketoacidosis and HHS, hyposmolar hyperglycemic syndrome. So those are very grave complications of diabetic patients, the ketoacidosis. And the COVID patients, their likelihood of developing diabetic ketoacidosis is actually high. And old age, now in Sri Lankan data, we know that 70% of patients who have died of COVID are about the age of 70 years. And when they are old, they have diabetes, hypertension, in addition to that, they have, most of them have diabetes. So our diabetes prevalence in elderly patients are much higher. And then we have hypertension, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, slightly raised creatinine. They are all high in patients with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes. Next slide, please. Now, I have mentioned this earlier. Now, the patient can present with high blood sugar, and then we don't know. In some cases we know that the patient has been diagnosed with diabetes, but there can be patients who come with previously undiagnosed diabetes, and there are patients who come with what we call stress hyperglycemia. And as I mentioned, those with stress hyperglycemia, they do worse with regard to intercurrent illness, anything that requires intensive treatment. Next slide, please. Now this is again the same thing, previously diagnosed diabetes and then the previously undiagnosed diabetes when they come with high blood sugar. And I wanted to stress here this the stress hyperglycemia. So the people who come with stress hyperglycemia can have high blood sugar, but their HbA1c can be lower. So if someone comes with high blood sugar and the HbA1c is low, that means the patient has not had diabetes or hyperglycemia in the past. So if the HbA1c is low, that means it is stress hyperglycemia. But doesn't mean that patient is protected from the complications that you get in diabetes. Next slide, please. Yeah, pre-existing diabetes and the risk of severe disease and death. You can see there are plethora of publications in this regard, but all shows the same thing, that is comorbidity of diabetes was significantly associated with disease severity or mortality in COVID-19, which is statistically significant. You can see lower down, it is towards the positive side. Next slide, please. And pre-existing diabetes, comorbidity of diabetes, as I said, is higher in significantly associated with disease severity. And there's a need for improving glycemic control in patients with hyperglycemia, that we all know, irrespective of whether they had diabetes in the past or not. As I mentioned, they have high inflammatory markers, and there is higher chance of developing diabetes ketoacidosis and HHS in these patients. Next slide, please. So how do we protect our patients with diabetes during COVID pandemic? Next slide, please. Yeah, now this is diabetes management in COVID pandemic. You can see there are various things that we can do. Adequate metabolic control, regular home blood sugar monitoring or CGM, and connected health models and telemedicine, which has been very effective, and carefully adjust the regular therapy and vaccination. Actually, the vaccination part should come bigger here, because the best treatment for the COVID is to prevent getting COVID, especially for diabetes patients. So vaccination has become the mainstay in the management of COVID world over. You know that the countries like United Kingdom, America, Canada, they are actually now easing off their restrictions because they have been very successful in vaccinating people. So vaccination, when we do, we have to look at the mortality. So why we are vaccinating? We are vaccinating to prevent someone from dying or someone from getting chronic complications of COVID infection. So, and the data so far gathered in the world suggests very well that it is the elderly patients with a lot of comorbidities who succumb to this illness most. So even in Sri Lankan data, 84% of patients who have died have complications, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, old age, and so on. So the vaccination strategy is very important. So in developed countries and in places where people use the common sense and all, they vaccinate the elderly population first. They even in Asian countries, they vaccinate the elderly population first, then those with comorbidities, and then they come down in the age limits as the vaccine becomes more available. Now we in our nation we have only 20 million people, so we don't have 20 million vaccine. So we have maybe 2 million vaccine. So it's a matter of deciding whom to be given the vaccine. And for that, actually, if we can't think much, we can actually look at the developed countries and see how they have achieved, reducing mortality due to COVID just by, scientifically administering vaccine. So we all, I think, should promote the vaccination for our diabetic patients, and especially the elderly patients with diabetes. And our college, the Sri Lanka College of Endocrinologists, we have given some press release, and we have written to the authorities at the outset, stressing the importance of vaccinating the people in a scientific manner, right? So it is. I hope it will happen at least now. Next slide, please. Please, next slide. Yeah, just go on. Yeah, go on. Yeah, these are the plasma glucose concentration and the glycemic targets we need to maintain in our patients. You all know that the chronic glycemic targets like HbA1c less than 7%, which is not the best, but it is a reasonable target. And the blood sugar, pre-meal blood sugar targets are close to 100, and the post-meal less than 180. And the CGM target, CGM is not used in Sri Lanka, but those targets we all know what our patients should be maintaining. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, pre-infection glycemic control and disease severity. Now, this slide shows that worse pre-existing glucose control indicates the higher risk of severe cause of infection. Now, the first one on your left-hand side shows the association with the HbA1c. You can see when the HbA1c goes up, the severity goes up. Now, like in UK-PDS trial, they have found that when the HbA1c is reduced by 1%, you reduce the risk of developing severe COVID-19 infection by about 21%. Now, why I said point UK-PDS is because UK-PDS showed that when you reduce the HbA1c by 1%, you reduce the risk of microvascular complications by maybe about 30%. So similarly, the HbA1c is very important, and the blood sugar control is very important. It is one of the most effective methods of treating the patients before getting COVID, because when you reduce HbA1c, their complications are already reduced by 1/5. Next slide, please. Next one, please. Yeah. So what do we do in the presence of mild COVID infection? So what do we do? How do we manage our patients? Do we have to get down all the patients? Come to our clinics. Now we are going to adjust your drugs according to the COVID guideline? No, we can't. We don't need to do that, because the patients who are okay and in outpatient setting, we don't need to change anything. Actually, we can just continue the hyperglycemic treatment as it is, and just that you have to stress on more frequent blood sugar measurements and the healthy lifestyle and adherence to treatment. And when the patient gets admitted, the things will change, because then the patient is in a hospital setup. So before that, it is just the maintenance of the normal glycemic control, dietary control, exercise, reduce the risk of hypoglycemia, and monitoring the renal functions and so on. Next slide. Next slide. And this is these are the drugs that they used the previous one. Previous slide. Yeah, these are the drugs that we used in for diabetic patients. Now we will take each drug separately, and we'll discuss what's going to happen with each drug when you have COVID. Now, metformin actually is a wonderful drug. It is very important that you continue metformin in most of the patients, especially when the patient is in outpatient setup, or patient has mild COVID infection, just like a normal viral fever. You don't need to stop metformin, right? But when the patient is compromised, like a patient is admitted to the hospital, patient has renal or hepatic or cardiac problems, we don't usually use metformin, because the effects are unpredictable, and also it can cause lactic acidosis, and the toxicity will be more. So especially when there's a renal failure. when the creatinine has gone up, and when there is a hepatic problem, your transaminases have gone up, then you can't be using metformin, because you can't be using, and it's not effective also, because you can't predict the blood sugar control very well with metformin. So in such situations, in the severely ill patients, you have to stop metformin. Now sulfonylurea, we use widely glycoside, glimepiride, and so on. So we have to actually stop it if there is the patient is developing sort of a severe disease because of the risk of hypoglycemia. Because when the food intake is not regular and the patient can't take regular caloric food, then your risk of hypoglycemia is more. And not only that, if you are using chloroquine, it will potentiate the effect of hypoglycemic effect of sulfonylurea. So you can't use the sulfonylurea in severely ill patients because of those reasons. DPP-4 inhibitors can be continued. There is no big issue with DPP-4 inhibitors unless the patient is in severe form. SGLT2 inhibitors, and actually it is as you know, the mechanism of SGLT2 inhibitors is you get rid of your sugar in urine. So if you can't maintain a good fluid intake, you should not be using SGLT2 inhibitors, especially when the renal functions are compromised. By giving SGLT2 inhibitors, you can worsen the renal function because it will dehydrate the person and will develop a pre-renal failure. So if the patient is ill, unable to eat, is not sounding good, you can ask the patient to stop the SGLT2 inhibitors, because the HbA1c reduction with SGLT2 inhibitors are not great, right? It's less than 1%. And you're not going to wait till it happens. In the acute stage, you don't just want the blood sugar to be controlled as soon as possible. So then you have to go back for insulin. So this drug you can stop easily. 5-glitazone, again, it's a wonderful drug, but you can't be giving it in acute stage because of the fluid retention, worsening of heart failure, and also so on. So it is actually not the best to give. Insulin is the drug of choice for critical ill patients. Not only critical ill patients, for all those who don't achieve their glycemic targets with the oral hypoglycemics and lifestyle or whatever, you have to consider starting insulin early on. So that is how you get the HbA1c at the goal. So if you wait and don't start insulin, patient already has high HbA1c, then there is no time for you to do the things and get it down. So you have to do it act early. AIS inhibitors and ARBs I mentioned, they might theoretically increase the expression of ACE2 receptor, which is the entry point for the COVID-2 virus. But still, the current recommendation is to continue it unless they are contraindicated due to other reasons like hyperkalemia or worsening renal functions or so on. Aspirin you can continue, and actually you all know that this is a prothrombotic state, the COVID, and people use low molecular weight heparin in varying doses, and aspirin as well. So aspirin, if you are on the aspirin, you don't need to stop it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, at the insulin, there are various thoughts about the mechanism of action of insulin, and it increases the pH according to this slide. That the high pH is not conducive to the virus to thrive. So that's been suggested as a protective mechanisms, prevent the COVID infections. Next slide. Which insulin regime can help ensure blood glucose control with convenience? Next slide. So when you use insulin, that is a problem. So insulin used during infection. So as I mentioned, it is favored over other oral glucose lowering agents for glycemic control in hospitalized patients because of the predictability and the efficacy. Right, basal insulin on top of oral drugs for non-critical patients with poor glycemic control. Now, the patients who are on oral hypoglycemics and the blood sugar control is not great, and they are not very ill. So then those patients, you can top up them with the dose of basal insulin, and then expect their glycemic control to be improved. So that can be done, right? basal bolus regime for further intensification of control. Now, when you use the basal insulin, you find that the fasting has improved, but the post-meal values are higher. Then you can actually go for bolus insulin on top of the basal insulin, which we call basal bolus regime. And insulin infusion for critical ill patients, and you need to avoid sliding scale of insulin, which I discuss in a little while. Next slide, please. Yeah, now this slide shows out of the insulins we have, out of the oral therapies we have, insulin is the most efficacious one that we know. Now every drug there is a efficacy. Now SGLT2 inhibitors, the HbA1c reduction is as same as the DPP4 inhibitors, like that. So they are like the efficacy is we know already, but in insulin there is no upper limit. Your HbA1c you can reduce by 4% by giving insulin, but it depends on the pre-treatment HbA1c as well. So it is there with insulin. So premix insulin has been shown to be the most effective method in the outpatient setting to reduce the HbA1c. Right. Next slide, please. Now this is this is the famous graph you all know. This is the insulin excursions after taking a carbohydrate meal. Insulin secretion is sort of biphasic. You have a rapid rise in the insulin activity and insulin secretions in the blood, and then it comes down rapidly, and then it is maintained at a certain level and then goes back to the basal level slowly. So this is the physiological insulin secretion curve. Now we are trying to mimic this curve, as you know, by adopting various insulin regimens. We are trying to mimic the physiological insulin secretion. Now how do we do that? Is by using various types of insulin. Now we used to have soluble insulin or short-acting insulin, which will have the peak only. You can see that the top part, that part we can achieve by using the soluble insulin. And then you have biphasic insulin, the normal biphasic insulin, which is the combination of short-acting and long-acting protamine zinc insulin. So that insulin you have a slightly closer curve to the physiological insulin secretion. But the premixed analog insulin has the best match to the normal insulin secretions. That's why it has been shown that the premix analogs are better in terms of various things like hypoglycemia, various things which we'll discuss in a little while. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is again just to illustrate it in a more clearer manner. The rapid acting insulin, you can see Lispro, Aspart, Lysine, those are the very ultra rapid acting insulin that we use. And generally in our Sri Lankan hospital setting, we use short acting or regular insulin, that is rapid insulin mostly. And then there is intermediate action insulin, NPH insulin, and then you have long acting insulin, insulin glargine and insulin detamag, which are all available. But what we use in each patient depends on patient's blood sugar profile. Next slide, please. Now this is the insulin molecule, and as you can see, the Aspart has there's a modification of one of the amino acids substitution, and by doing that, they have achieved the physiological, they have achieved the best match to the physiological insulin secretions. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is again about biphasic Aspart and the human insulin, the premix human insulin. You can see the difference in NPH insulin and all. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is again a pharmacological profile of biphasic Aspart insulin. You can see it goes up, it matches the physiological needs in these slides. Next slide, please. Yeah, compared with the biphasic human insulin, Aspart 30 has faster absorption. That's why you need to give it fast and eat. Like, normal insulin, you have to inject and wait for half an hour, and then only you have to eat. But this is not done by most of it. Let's say over 50% of our patients don't know the timing of taking insulin. Some of them don't know how to take insulin. Most of patients don't know the timing of insulin because they think you have to eat the moment you inject the insulin. That is true if you are using biphasic aspart insulin or insulin analogs, biphasic analog insulin, because the absorption is faster. But in the normal, insulin biphasic normal insulin, you have to wait for half an hour. Then only you have to eat. Otherwise, there is a mismatch between the insulin, the blood sugar excretion and the availability of insulin in the system. And that mismatch can cause hyperglycemia as well as hypoglycemia. A lot of problems. So timing is very important. And this insulin has a higher peak concentration. So it goes up quickly and comes down quickly, so that there is less chance for hypoglycemia. More rapid than pronounced glucose lowering effect, similar duration of action to basal component. So those are the features of biphasic aspart insulin. Next slide, please. Yeah, this again shows the the benefit of this insulin in terms of hypoglycemia. The faster insulins are better. We prefer them. When available, we use them. Next slide. Yeah, nocturnal hypoglycemia, again the biphasic aspart is better in terms of nocturnal hypoglycemia. Next slide, please. Yeah, and there are head-to-head trials on biphasic aspart versus glargine U100 or HbA1c. Now you can see it is easy to use once a day insulin, but when it comes to the HbA1c lowering, biphasic aspart or premix insulin, premix analog insulins are better. So this has been shown by multiple studies, which is there. So that is why the algorithms say when you start with basal insulin, and as you advance the regime, or if the patient is not coming under control, then you can have more advanced regime. So the first one to start after the basal insulin is basal bolus. Then you can go for biphasic insulin at the same time, like interchangeably. Like some people, there are people who won't be ready to take basal bolus regime because it's 4 injections in most of them, and sometimes it can be more injections, more than 4. So biphasic insulin is a good way of just taking the lead from the basal insulin alone. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now and glargine in terms of the fasting hypoglycemia, fasting blood sugar, there is not statistically significant difference. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is how you titrate the insulin regime. Now, this is the original slides that they have sent to me. Now, this is how you when the blood sugar is high, how you add the dose of insulin. Actually, this is mostly a matter of common sense. Now, a lot of people ask us, how do you start insulin? Now, the patient's blood sugar is 200. How much insulin you should give? But there is no answer. No, there's no clear-cut answer for that. Now, just because patient's blood sugar is 200, you don't give insulin a certain amount. You can't say you give 10 units of insulin for 200 blood sugar, or you can't say you can give 5 units, or you can give 50 units. It all depends. It all depends on multiple factors. That is why doctors are there to decide on individual basis how to control the blood sugar. Now, let's say obese patients who is on like 100 units of insulin, but still the blood sugar is not controlled. So there's no point in increasing that by 2 units, right? So that means the patient is more resistant to insulin, and you have to, use a higher dose of insulin. And similarly, if the patient is lean and patient is not eating well, patient has a very high risk of hypoglycemia, then sometimes you don't have to increase insulin at all, or it depends. So there are multiple factors, and like comorbidities, renal failure, hypoglycemic risk, and the cardiovascular disease, whether the patient is hypoglycemia prone, eating pattern, because whether the patient is taking regular meals, or patient skips meal, or patient is there are patients who are on tube feeding, NG feeding, and so on. So your insulin regime depends on the patient's characteristics. But roughly, when you start, this is how you can start. You can have this as a rough guide. Next slide, please. Now, I have told you most of these things. Now, you can go by the body weight formula. Like in the type 1 patients, generally we go by like 0.5 units per kilogram type of a dose to start with, or even 0.2 to 0.5 smaller dose. But in type 2 patients, it can be slightly higher. So underweight, old age, hemodialysis, that kind of patient, we should start with a smaller dose. Normal weight, 0.5, 0.4 units per kilogram. And overweight, we tend to go by slightly higher dose. And obese, insulin resistant glucocorticoids, as I mentioned, you need to start a higher dose of insulin. The total daily dose of insulin is calculated based on the various factors, body weight, and then the insulin resistance, and you look at the previous records, what has happened when you give insulin, it has gone crashed or whatever. So based on that, to decide how much insulin you should start. Next slide, please. Now, how do you adjust the insulin? This is someone who is on basal bolus regime. So if the fasting is too high or too low, what you have to do? You have to adjust not the pre-breakfast insulin. So that is a very important rule. That is what our patients do. Our patients, when they find their blood sugar is 200 in the morning, they might take 10 units more. But when they find it 90, they might not take insulin at all, which is wrong. So your blood sugar, the current blood sugar, depends on what you ate previously and how much insulin you took previously. For someone who is on insulin. So if your fasting blood sugar is too high, then there's no point in increasing the morning dose of insulin, which you can do to a certain extent, but you have to look at what patient ate at night and how much insulin patient took before the dinner. So if the insulin dose before the dinner was not adequate, you have to go up on that dose. And if the patient is hypoglycemic in the morning, you have to reduce the night dose. Like that, pre-lunch too low or too high, you have to change the pre-breakfast dose one before. Pre-dinner, you have to adjust the pre-lunch dose. Bedtime too low or high, adjust the pre-dinner insulin dose. And if it's out of range, then you have to check the basal regime and adjust everything. Right? Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the algorithm for insulin aspart 30 intensification from basal insulin. As you can see, now the guidelines mostly say that you start with basal insulin in the first go, right? Basal insulin or bedtime insulin and daytime oral hypoglycemia type of oral hypoglycemia drugs type of a dose. And on your left hand side, you see patients who don't achieve the blood sugar targets. Fasting is higher, so they need to titrate the basal insulin to achieve the fasting first. If the fasting is achieved, but still your HbA1c is above 8 on your right hand side, then you have to go for a more complex regimen like basal bolus or twice a day insulin. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, sliding scale of insulin. I just wanted to speak a little bit about insulin because it is very important. Now, sliding scale of insulin, we just go by these insulin, the cutoff. Now, in our house of days, what we do is, if the blood sugar is 200, we subtract 100 divided by 10. Divide it by 10. So 200, it is 100 divided by 10 is 10 units. So we give 10 units. And if the blood sugar is low, 120, we don't give insulin, which is wrong. I'll show you why. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is called reactive approach. You wait till it happens and then you act on that, right? So you wait till the blood sugar goes up and then you act on that. So this is what we usually do in our diabetic patients. We give oral hypoglycemic medications. We add one after the other, like that we add and then ultimately we find that the blood sugar is not controlled, and then we think about insulin. So by the time we start thinking about insulin, the patient has already had high HbA1c for considerable length of time. and which actually increase their glycemic burden, and we call it glycemic memory or whatever, and they are susceptible for chronic complications of hyperglycemia. So what is needed is to achieve the blood sugar target right from the beginning. So for that you might need to start insulin early. So this is called reactive approach, because you wait till the blood sugar goes up and then you decide on how much insulin to give based on the blood sugar. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there are advantages and disadvantages. Advantages is it is easy, so anybody can understand. You can write it on a piece of paper and say, if it is about 200, give this much, above 300, another 10, another 4, above 400, give another 10. Like that, you can give clear instructions. But the problem is, it is not evidence-based. There is no benefit by doing that. And it can cause what is called a roller coaster effect, which I will mention. I will show in a while. Next slide, please. This is called roller coaster effect of insulin sliding scale. Now, when the blood sugar is high, we give an insulin shot, and then the blood sugar comes down, and then we don't give insulin, and then the blood sugar naturally will go up, and then we give insulin again, it will come down. So this is called roller coaster effect. This is what we generally tend to do in our setups, which is wrong, because ultimately patient does not achieve sustained euglycemia or normoglycemia. It's been either high or low, and it doesn't, allow you to maintain a good HbA1c level. So this has to be avoided, and you have to, the correct method is you decide on the patient's insulin requirement based on total daily dose and or various other factors I mentioned earlier, and then you decide. Like yourself, you decide, like, yeah, I'm going to give this patient 30 units of insulin per day. And you decide how you are going to give that 30 units. Whether you are going to give it in the form of basal bolus or pre-mixed, or how much are you going to give it for the morning, how much are you going to give for the lunch and the dinner. So it all depends on your experience and the expertise and knowledge and patient factors and all those things. So that you have to make the decision. Next slide, please. Yeah. So biphasic aspart insulin. The people with type 2 diabetes, they have to have good glycemic control. So you have a good reason why most of the patients should be on biphasic insulin, because by the time they come with diabetes, they have had it for some time, and their blood sugar targets have not been met for years and years. So there is no time for you to lose. That's one thing. And the other thing is, the biphasic insulin covers both basal and bolus, basal and prandial insulin, because of, and it mimics the physiological curve mostly, because so you can use this insulin as the first thing in some of our patients. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So thank you very much. So this is all what we have to say about diabetes and COVID. Just if I am to summarize, now, as you know, diabetes is a major risk factor for increased mortality in COVID. So it is not very clear whether diabetic patients are more susceptible to contract the infection. But there are reports that it does, that the patients have slightly higher risk of contracting diabetes, which is not yet proven. But it has been shown beyond doubt very clearly that the diabetic patients have a higher chance of developing complications, and not only complications, the death due to COVID. Now in China, they have looked at the prevalence of diabetes in patients admitted with COVID. They found that the prevalence of diabetes is about 10%, which is the same prevalence in community outside. So that means there is no increased risk of getting diabetes, getting COVID. But when they analyze the patients who develop the severe disease, about 37% of those patients have diabetes. So that means the severe illness is more in patients with diabetes. So that is a very good take-home message. And the other thing I need to say is the risk of COVID and complications can be reduced by about 20% if your HbA1c, if you reduce the HbA1c by 1%. So before you get the COVID, before your patient gets the COVID, you have to try and get their HbA1c controlled, so that even if they get COVID, their risk of developing severe disease and the death is minimal. And next, we have to think about the alteration in the lifestyle and the dynamics of patients. Lifestyle matters a lot when it comes to lifestyle disease like diabetes. The accessibility of the medications, monitoring, and the exercise and all that we mentioned, the nutritious food and all that, so that we have to take into account. And the things like telemedicine, WhatsApp, and the webinars like these, public talks, and those things matter a lot, because then patients have time at home to do it, to listen to those things. When you have COVID and the mild infection, you don't have to worry and quickly change everything. So you can continue the same medications unless patient has any of the indicators that patient is going to get the severe disease, which is actually a crucial decision which has to be made by you. There's nobody else. So you have to look at the patient's general well-being. If the patient is ill, not eating, high fever, short of breath, and a lot of comorbidities, you have to persuade patients to get admitted. Now the policy of managing patients with COVID is changing every day. Now earlier we used to catch all the patients. For some reason, I don't know, you can take the patient who is diagnosed with COVID at Ratmalana. You take the patient from Ratmalana and put the patient in the bus, and you take the patient to Pune, somewhere far away, and you keep the patient there for 2 weeks. You feed the patients on a state funds, and you transport the patient back and forth from the home. So that was the management that we did earlier. All the diabetic patients were taken in and institutionalized and fed, and then you observe those patients. But in the West, they were more practical and they couldn't afford that kind of a service. So they asked patients to stay at home if they feel okay, because patients are sensible. So they know when they are not well. So by that, you can, prevent the overloading, the healthcare system. And then you have the vaccine, which we have to promote all the time, because our patients come every day and ask whether it is okay to take the vaccine, because they are already on an injection. So today also a patient came and asked me, I'm already taking insulin injection, whether it is okay for me to take the COVID vaccine. And some of the patients are waiting for the best vaccine to come. They don't understand the importance of getting any kind of vaccine, because all the vaccines that have completed phase 3 trials and come to the market have been shown to be effective. So most of the vaccines are very effective. So they reduce the COVID by nearly 70%. So our all diabetic patients should take the vaccine in their first opportunity, so that we as the general practitioners or any doctor should promote the patients to go and take the vaccine, whatever the vaccine being given from the government. And then the prioritization of the vaccine, which is not under our control, which is decided by the government and the health authorities, whom to give vaccine first. And we as doctors should know that the countries, developed countries, have got their success stories just by scientifically giving the vaccine. First to the elderly, frail, patients with comorbidities, healthcare workers, and then come down in the age group. So they are actually in the UK. The Queen was given first, and then the Prince William got the vaccine recently. And the diabetic patients in the group 6 also, they moved the population and they nicely decided how to administer vaccine. So that kind of things I hope will come in Sri Lanka, because then only you can control this disease. And next we have to know the importance of insulin. If your patient is not already on insulin, having high blood sugar, that means there is a failure. Failure may be from your side or from the patient's side. There is a failure to improve, glycemic, attain the glycemic targets. Then you should not waste time. You can start them on insulin, even as the outpatient basis. And if the patient is, getting ill, then you have to start insulin, and the patient should be transferred to secondary care. And then the telemedicine and the health promotion, that kind of things you have to do all the time. So that's it I have to say about the managing, protecting your diabetic patients during this COVID pandemic. Thank you.
we can entertain questions from the audience. There's a question to Dr. Chamila Garusingha. Can EMPA be continued in a COVID positive diabetic patient?
Yeah, it depends on the patient's general conditions. As I mentioned, empagliflozin is not a very wonderful drug in terms of HbA1c control and controlling the diabetes in acute setup. So if the patient is acutely ill and is having swinging blood sugar like 200, 300, so it is not the drug. So because it might worsen the situation by dehydrating the patient. So especially if the patient is not maintaining enough oral intake, then your glycosuria can worsen the hydration, and patient will have more thrombosis due to dehydration and hemoconcentration. So it's not a wonderful drug to be on when you have acute illness, especially if you are not maintaining the hydration. So you can stop it actually, and you can substitute with something else.
There's another question. Should aspirin be started early in a diabetic patient who is COVID positive but asymptomatic or has mild symptoms? If so, for how long?
Yeah, actually, just for COVID, whether you should start patients on aspirin as the first line treatment for COVID is still not established. If the patient is on aspirin, you don't need to stop it. But if the patient's condition is severe enough for him to get admitted to the hospital, they will use the low molecular weight heparin and so on. So I don't think you can quickly start insulin on the aspirin on these patients and expect any better outcome. But it depends. Like if the patient qualifies for aspirin due to other factors like multiple cardiovascular risk factors, high cholesterol, pressure, and so on, then you have to start.
There's another question. If a steroid is started in a moderate COVID positive patient who is diabetic, should the dose and frequency of their OHS be increased, or should they be started on short-acting insulin for that time of period?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because we see the patients who are being discharged from the hospitals, they have been given steroids, high doses, and the effect of steroids can sometimes last up to 1 month. So then actually you should not waste time. You should start the patients on insulin at the earliest opportunity, because those patients can go into HHS, hyposmolar hypoglycemic syndrome, especially these patients on steroids, because after the steroid dose, their blood sugar can go up fast. But sometimes, if the levels are not very high, you can actually maintain them on oral hypoglycemics and with frequent monitoring, and increase the hydration and so on. So it depends on the glycemic targets. That brings us to the problems of the glycemic targets in the critically ill patients. Now, the hospitalized patients with COVID, we like to maintain the blood sugar, any blood sugar less than 100 to 140. And elderly patients who is not very critically ill, you can go up to 180. So that is the target. So if you can achieve that target easily, then you don't need to actually start insulin. But mostly, yes, you need.
Doctor, we have a question from the online audience. Shall I share one of it with you?
Yeah.
Yep. So Dr. Navras has asked how to initiate insulin as an outpatient. What is the best site to inject insulin, and how can we train the patient?
That's how to start insulin. Now, obviously, that patient has failed on the oral treatment. Various guidelines say various methods how to use insulin. Now, the European guidelines say you have to start on a basal insulin, bedtime long-acting insulin, titrate up, try to achieve best fasting blood sugar, and then look at your HbA1c and the post-meal blood sugars. And if they are high, you add basal plus, basal bolus, and so on, which is the guideline, what guidelines say. But the thing is, our patients have already, practically, they have missed the bus. Most of the patients, by the time we think of starting them on insulin, they have passed that period. So they may not be, able to control the blood sugar alone only with basal insulin. Because we should have started it way before, when the patient starts, deteriorating while on oral hypoglycemia. But most of patients can be started on premixed insulin as the first thing, twice a day insulin, because I showed you in the slide that premixed insulins are more efficacious in lowering the HbA1c than basal insulin. So we should actually, most of our patients, we should go for biphasic insulin, and the dose depends on various factors, as I mentioned: obesity, frailty, hypoglycemic risk, meal pattern, and the type of work. Those who work in the field, who walk and all that, you can start with a small dose. But I think the most important thing is you have to always start with a small dose, and then you can see how the patient responds. Now, I happen to listen to one of the speakers, a US speaker. She was telling how in the general practice, how they start insulin. Now, she said they start recently in American College of Endocrinology, but they say they start 10-10. So you do 10 in the morning, 10 at night. So that is for there are a lot of positive things in that. Because if you start like 18 in the morning, 80 at night, patient finds it difficult to dial 80. They get confused because they are already confused, like most of us. So they confused. So you have to start with like a very easy regime first. That is the number one thing. You can start like 10-10, and the preferred site is the abdomen, because it is easy to inject by yourself. You can inject here as well, but it depends on the fat layer here. So if you are like skinny, if you are wasted due to diabetes, when you inject the insulin here, it goes IM. Now you have to inject it under the subcutaneous layer. It should dissolve in the fat and get absorbed slowly. So if you inject it to the IM, the half-life of insulin is very short. So if you do IV insulin, its half-life is a matter of couple of minutes. If you do IV insulin, it acts and it gets eliminated quickly. So therefore, you have to get a site where there is adequate adipose tissue, and you have to see the patient's vision and all those things, and start with a simple regime, and then advance as the patient gets used to the insulin. That's what I usually do.
Thank you, Doctor. Over to you, Dr. Matthew.
There's another question. Can giving an immunosuppressant like IL-6 inhibitor be detrimental to a diabetic patient and make their condition worse?
Actually, now IL-6 inhibitors, and those will be given when there is cytokine storm. So then actually there are criteria to use those medications. So you don't use it in outpatient basis. You use it when the patient is in a severe condition. Like there are criteria like hypoxia, the arterial blood gas, and all those things, chest X-ray. When you look at them, and they decide whether you should start IL-6 inhibitors. But when you have to do it actually. You can't withhold that just because the patient has diabetes, because you are trying to prevent the cytokine storm and the lung damage and so on. So that is, of course, is not a very relevant thing when it comes to the practical situation.
There's another question. I think more or less you answered that question. Which vaccine is the best for a diabetic patient?
That's the thing. Now we don't need to decide actually. In the rest of the world also, the patients don't decide. And in Canada, it is the patient is set told that you have to be ready to take whatever the vaccine given by the state, like that. So all the vaccines, as I mentioned, they have passed the hurdles. They have been shown to be effective. At least 60% or more than nearly 70%, all the vaccines are effective. So it is the matter of availability, whether it is AstraZeneca or Sinopharm or Moderna. So it's the availability. So if you have the vaccine, whatever the vaccine available in the first instance, you should go and take it. So it's not under your hand anyway. It's the government and the officials who will decide which vaccine to purchase and which vaccine to be given. So in Sri Lanka, it's been the healthcare is mostly about nearly 50% of healthcare is done by the general practitioners and the private hospitals, but still the vaccine is 100% government. So it is, so we have to depend on what the government, gets down and decides. And I hope they decide based on the evidence. So that's what happens.
Next question is more about the Sinopharm. Why cannot the Sinopharm vaccine be given to a poorly controlled diabetic?
Actually, this is the earliest thoughts. When the Sinopharm was launched, there were some guidelines. They say not for diabetes, not for elderly, like that, because the studies were not done on those high-risk populations. So therefore, people were reluctant to give the vaccine to these diabetic patients and the elderly patients. But now it has been used widely, and people have found there is no problem. So you can give the vaccine to diabetics without any issues. Not only diabetics, now you know that we are very careful in giving the drug to a pregnant woman, pregnant mother. Now Sinopharm and all the other vaccines we give to pregnant mothers, because there's plenty of evidence that there is no problem in taking the vaccine. So similarly, diabetics and those who are on immunosuppressant and all that, they should take the vaccine, because this is not a replicating vaccine. So there are vaccines in the past. Those are replicating vaccines. When you inject, it replicates in the body and cause mild disease and then provoke the antibody production. But these are killed virus particles and suspensions, or RNA, or the virus, the covering, spike protein, or whatever. So those things are not living things. They are just the pieces of protein and nucleotides. So your immune response will develop, and if it does not develop, that's another problem. But currently we don't look at the antibody levels, but there will be a time when we look at the antibody level. So when that happens, then you can decide which vaccine is more effective. But most of these vaccines, all of these vaccines are safe to be given for any patients with immunocompromise. Yeah, because they are non-replicating vaccines.
Are the risks different for people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
That's difficult questions, but studies have generally not shown, the initial studies at least have not shown a big difference between type 1 and type 2, because they have not compared it head to head. But type 1, there have been more cases of ketoacidosis with COVID. So therefore, it is we can assume that type 1 patients will do worse with type COVID infection, because they anyway do when they get the current illness. So therefore, we can assume, but generally we should not be very much worried, because it depends on your average pre-infection blood sugar control and how you manage the diabetes throughout the illness.
This is going to be the last question.
Yeah.
This is the last question. Does COVID-19 cause diabetes?
Yeah, actually, a lot of viruses have been shown to cause diabetes. We know mumps virus can cause pancreatitis and diabetes. And there is evidence that the MERS, Middle East acute respiratory virus, that came long before, it's in the same family, that caused new onset diabetes. So likewise, there is growing evidence that this also COVID-2 also can cause diabetes theoretically, because it affects the pancreas, because the pancreas also has got these ACE2 receptors, plenty of them. So the virus can go into the pancreas easily and can upset the pancreatic thing. So actually, there is no very strong evidence to say it directly causes diabetes, because it's very hard to say that, because there can be new onset diabetes, so undiagnosed diabetes, or stress hypoglycemia, or whatever, that all will manifest as the high blood sugar. So it's difficult to say, but theoretically, yes, it can cause new onset diabetes according to the previous data and so on.
Now I'd like to thank Dr. Chaminda Garasinghe, who gave an extensive lecture, as well as the question and answer session was a little prolonged. And I thank the host, Novo Nordisk, for hosting this event. And more than anything, our participants who are enthusiastic participating. with us, and there were a large number of registrants were there. So we are happy that our endeavor was a success, mainly because of the participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. So we have come to an end of this interesting webinar on how to protect your diabetes patient during COVID pandemic. So first of all, I want to thank all of the participants, the doctors who have joined from Sri Lanka as well as Asian countries. Thank you very much, doctors, for joining us today during this Sunday evening. From all of us at Novo Nordisk, it's a big thank to you. And not forgetting our chairperson, Dr. Matthew, who guided us throughout this session, who chaired this session. Thank you very much, sir, for coming and chairing this session. And last but not least, Dr. Chaminda Garusinghe, without you, sir, we wouldn't have had a lecture. It was very informative. Like, it was very interesting the way you took us through the lecture. So thank you very much, sir, for coming and giving this lecture, both of you doctors, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you and have a good night.
Shafaq, can you stop broadcasting? And we can stay on.
Amin? I can hear that.
Shafaq, can you stop broadcasting? Is there option?
See 400.
Okay. No, it's okay. No?
Right?